Hi guys! Since I finished my Element Doll series last week with the element of Earth, I promised to make a showcase video so you guys could see the dolls together. I'll also be going further into the process of making the dolls, reviewing my results and mistakes that didn't make it into the videos, so I hope you enjoy and let's get started. Firstly, I'll be talking about the collection as a whole. So here they are together, all four. As of right now, I consider the collection to be complete, even though some of you have requested additional dolls like Ice, Dark and Light, which I might choose to add in a future video. If you haven't seen the original individual videos, I'll leave a link to the playlist in the info box. These dolls have all had their joints glued to make them fixed figurines, which was a first for me. The only joint I didn't glue was the head, since I felt it was a little easier to work on then when the head could be turned. On the first two dolls of the series, I kept the heads on the doll for the whole process, which I don't do normally. That posed some slight difficulties when I painted the details of the face, since the bodies in their fixed positions seemed to get in the way a little bit. For the other two, I removed the head and worked on the head and body separately, which seems to work way better for me. Each doll is a little different, but I tried to keep them coherent still. The first three was relatively easy to get to match to each other, since both water, air and fire have a somewhat flowy or wavy character to them. They also have a certain sense of transparency. The element of Earth is a little different though. I find it to the more solid of the bunch, without the same sense of flow. Therefore I felt it had to be portrayed a little differently, but I still wanted it to go with the others. I'm happy with the way this little collection came out, and I'm really happy that you guys seem to enjoy them too. I originally started by just making the water nymph, and then people just started requesting the other elements. Previously I wanted to make a series of fairies like forest fairy, water fairy and so on, so that idea was kind of merged into this little series. My original thought for the fairies was to have them in elaborate dresses corresponding with their theme, but since I switched it to be pure elements, I changed my mind. I didn't feel like these elemental nymphs or fairies or whatever would feel the need to wear real clothes, since they are, to me, not really physical beings, more like spirits and part of their element, so therefore I decided to keep them fairly unclothed. To get the dolls to stand on their own, I glued them to the bottom of clear doll stands. I got the stands on eBay quite some time ago, and they seemed to be the most subtle option that I had on hand. If I were to have sold these, I would have found them a nicer stand, but since they're just for me, these will do. I also feel that they function more like figurines now that they can stand on their own without having to lean on something. So that's all I had to say on the collection as a whole. So now we're gonna move on to the dolls separately, in the order that I made them. That brings us to Water. As I said, she was the first of the series, and initially she was going to stand alone. Since I wanted to try and make a figurine, I decided to cover the joints and paint the body with acrylic paint. This turned out to warrant some difficulties, like getting the dry clay I used to blend seamlessly with the body. I also forgot to file the lines on the plastic on the doll's legs, which suddenly got very apparent once the paint was on. Using acrylic paint for this purpose was also new to me, and you have to keep your layers thin to try and minimize the visual brush strokes. If you're going to be painting a lot of dolls opaque like this, I think an airbrush might be a good investment. A side note that didn't make it into the tutorial was that I originally intended for her to have bigger and more prominent nymph ears, but I forgot to build them out in the air dry clay before I painted the entire body. After that I was too afraid to try and add them, since I was afraid to mess up all the paint of the face, therefore I scrapped the idea. I was also intending to incorporate more colors, like adding greens and purples to her, but as I was working on her I grew to like the monochromatic look more and more, and therefore I decided to stick with it. Again, this was a little different than what I've done previously, and it was really fun to try. Her hair was an eventful process. I wanted it to look like it was submerged and flowing in a water stream, so I chose to recycle some plastic doll hair from a previous doll, thinking that the stiff plastic hair would hold its shape better. The good news is it did. The bad news, on the other hand, was that it was too hard to handle, and I couldn't get the hairline as nice as I wanted. When I tried to glue the wefts onto the opposite direction and then flip them over for a natural hairline, the stiff hair just flared out and revealed the glue from the layers beneath it. So I feel this was one of my more unfortunate choices of the project. The wings that made it onto the doll were actually the second pair I made. The first pair didn't turn out so well. I made them from liquid latex, cause I wanted to make them kinda like I made flexible mermaid tails in the past, but they turned out really floppy and my latex had gotten discolored with age, so it just looked really bad. So I scrapped that idea and made those instead. A few people noted that they thought the eyelashes was a bit over the top, and they are, but I like this very dramatic lashes for dolls like this, because I feel it gives them a very otherworldly look to them. Here's a little fabric tip. If you need a small piece of some type of fabric but in many colors, you can just buy white and then use alcohol markers to tint them. This is how I could use the same white fabric for both the water, air and fire doll. Moving on to air. After the first doll, I was very aware of the lines on the plastic and carefully filed them away before painting it. I also switched to another type of air dry clay for the joints, and that definitely turned out better than the first one, but I still wasn't completely happy with them. With her color scheme, I kinda struggled since air is perceived as transparent, where water is associated with blue. I decided to paint her in off-white and wanted to try and keep her monochromatic as well. However, I did need to choose a shading color because otherwise the doll would just end up looking very flat and two-dimensional. To keep it soft, I went with a golden brown and kept the shading very light. I wish I'd had brown eyelashes though, instead of black, since it would probably have complemented the shading a little better, but I couldn't find any brown ones in time and I decided to settle for what I had. Even though Win is transparent, I really like the idea of her having white feather wings, since they're often associated with light and airy. For the water doll, I added glitter on the wings since water can look both shiny and sparkly, but for the air I kept away from any glitter since air just don't have that same quality. Finally, for her hair, I chose to use brushed out acrylic yarn since it's more light and fluffy. This turned out to be the way better choice since it will pretty much stick out from the head in the direction that it was glued, meaning I could get the look of hair blowing in the wind. Overall, I felt I had a little less issues in the making of this doll than the first one. Well, practice makes perfect, I guess. Next up is fire. Again, for this one, I had some troubles with my concept, since I felt there was way too many ways it could turn out badly. I was afraid to paint her opaquely with acrylic paint, cause if I made her orange, yellow or red, she could have ended up looking like a big chili pepper. Even though I really like the monochromatic feel, it just didn't seem to work for this one either, so I had to rethink that part as well. In the end, I chose to build up the colors of her body using layers of golden mica powder and shade with a coppery tone. This gave a sort of transparency since the original color of the doll sort of shines through, which I like. But this meant I couldn't cover her joints like I had the others, since the different color of the original doll and the clay would look obvious. In the end, I came to the realization that I wasn't really badly bothered by the joints. I returned to the glittery and transparent wings for the fire element, since it felt more fitting for this one than air. Dancing flames are somewhat transparent and the glitter could be sparks flying around her. They also added a bit of orange to the palette without being too much. I played around with different ideas for her hair before settling on this one. The first thing that comes to mind when thinking of fire hair would probably be to have it going upwards like a flame on top of her head. However, I felt it would look her make like a human torch and make her look too cartoony. I also played with the thought of having her hair ombre from orange to red, but when I tried doing that it just ended up looking really pastel and not good at all. Then I bought both an orange and a red yarn, thinking to use both of them to have two tones, but in the end I just used the red one since it just added much more character. Again, the yarn seems like a good choice since smaller strands can be twisted together for a spiky look. Finally, we're on to Earth, our last element. As I stated in the beginning, she's probably the one that sticks out the most compared to the others. I really tried to come up with ways for her to look more like the previous three, but all the components of the other dolls just seems out of place for this one since Earth as an element has less in common with the others to me. Earth is just the more solid than the others, and the others have flow and waves. So I just accepted that she would look very much like an individual, but I kept features like the wing and the eyelashes to have that in common. I chose a doll whose skin tone would look lovely for the element, so therefore I didn't want to cover her joints and mess that up. Some of the joints would eventually be covered with what I intended to look like 3 bark texture, but looking back I probably should have made the texture a bit more apparent. I was afraid of adding too thick a layer of clay onto her in case it would look out of place. I kept her color scheme to brown and green since brown alone might have looked very dull. I really wanted her to look alive and a part of nature, which I feel was helped along by the addition of green moss and leaves. Her wings is made of dried green leaves, which are kind of transparent to make them a little more subtle. As the only one of the dolls, and my first ever, I made her with her eyes closed. I did it to make her look serene and peaceful, and I actually really liked how it turned out. The dramatic eyelashes really pointed out and bring character, I feel. She's also the only one with the smooth viscose hair. I bought this long ago when I wanted to make a forest fairy, so it came in good use now. I made her hair swept backwards since I originally was planning on giving her a flower crown just made with leaves, but once everything else was on her, I felt it would just have looked too much, so I left it out. So what you all have probably learned about my process by now is that I come into my project with ideas of how it could be, but I let the project unfold and see how I feel things will end up looking the best as they can. So that brings us to the end of this little showcase. Sorry it ended up being a little long. Hopefully you found it somewhat interesting to dive a little deeper into this project with me. If you're still here, then thank you so much for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!